everyone, and welcome back to Mariana Mas Books. My name is Mariana, and welcome back to another Friday Reads type video, which is going to be focusing on the history stuff that I have learned throughout the week or the past couple of weeks. So, focusing on Historathon. Last week was my first ever Friday Reads video, and in that video I told you guys that I can't be doing weekly Friday Reads videos because I don't finish new books every week. I am constantly or all the time reading many books at the same time, so I am slowly making progress in every book that I am reading. So some weeks I finish books and others I don't. But while it is true that I don't have new books to talk about every single week, what is also true is that I have new things to say about the things that I am reading every single week. And so I thought, okay, I can't talk about new books every week, but I can talk about new things about the books every week. So I don't think I can commit to do Friday Reads every week. I would like to try. I'm not sure if I'm going to be successful, but I don't have to wait until I have new books to come and talk to you guys because I do have things to say. Also, when it comes to Historathon, as you know, I'm reading a lot of books in Spanish, and they're books that are not translated, and so I can't share them with you in so that you buy them and read them. But what I can do is talk about the stuff that I am learning, the stuff that they talk about, so that you can get that content too. One, because I really love it, and two, because that way I can share. So what I thought would be fun is that some Friday Reads videos can focus on general stuff from the fiction things that I'm reading, but then also there are other videos in which I can focus on the history, and what I'm going to do is talk about the history stuff that I have learned in those books. So today this is what we are going to do. Without further ado, let's just get into the topic of today, which comes from the book The Origins of Power in Mesoamérica by Enrique Florescano, that is not translated, but that if you are interested in reading Enrique Florescano, he does have some books translated to English, some of them more academic and out of print that you could maybe hunt down, but he has one that is available now, and it's available on Kindle if you like reading ebooks, and it's an essay collection called Memory, Myth, and Time in Mexico from the Aztecs to Independence. It's an essay collection that you are actually lucky to be able to get, because in Spanish it is out of print. I haven't been able to find it. If you want to read Florescano, that sounds fascinating. Today the topic is going to be the evolution of power in Mesoamerica, because while his book is titled The Origins of Power in Mesoamerica, and you do get the origins of the formation of the first centralized kingdoms, states, what the book is generally about, now that I am over halfway done with the book, is the evolution of power in Mesoamerica from its origins to the post-classical military states like the Aztecs, when eventually the conquest ended Mesoamerica. The very, very basics in terms of time periods for Mesoamerica is that it is divided in the pre-classical period that goes from 2500 BCE to 200 CE, and then you have the classical period that goes from the 200 CE to 900 CE, and then you have the post-classical period that goes from 900 CE to 1521, which is when the Spanish come, the year of the conquest, which effectively ends Mesoamerica, or it ends, the time period known as Mesoamerica. An important thing to note is that not every civilization fell with the conquest, but the time period known as Mesoamerica, it ends with, for historical study purposes, it ends with the conquest in 1521. In the pre-classical period, you have civilizations like the Olmecs or Teotihuacan. I think those are the big names in the pre-classical period. And then in the classical period, you have the big ones. The big ones are the Mayan kingdoms for the classical period. But then you also have Mayan, not kingdoms, which is what I want to talk about. You also have Mayan civilization states, centralized major civilizations in the post-classical period. And also in the post-classical period, of course, you have the Aztecs, and before that you have the Toltecs, and the Toltecs are very important in Mesoamerican lore and in history. I actually want to make a specific Friday Reads History Stuff video about the Toltecs and about King Arthur type figure in Mesoamerica that is super fascinating. Luckily for all of those topics, I will have books in English to talk about. I will have some bibliography to share. I'm preparing a video with book recommendations about Mesoamerican history in English that you can add to your pile of possibilities by quarter, but I am preparing that video, so I'm not sure when I'm going to upload it. I am going to upload it. I'm going to try to be as soon as possible so that if you can read some for quarter two, you can, but just so you know, that video is coming. But back to what I was talking about. So that is the basic division of periods in Mesoamerica. So that being said, that is something that I already knew, because as I said, that's like Mesoamerica 101, pre-classical, classical, post-classical. But what has been super interesting has been seeing the general type of government, of rulership, the different ways that the organization of power has looked like through the ages in Mesoamerica. So the type of organization of power in the pre-classical civilizations, and how that evolves all the way to the post-classical civilizations. In the pre-classical civilizations, you have the beginnings, of course, the beginnings of forming centralized states. The first centralized states that can be named as such, where you had a ruler that ruled over a geographical region that was centralized to one ideology, one identity, one form of power, one form of religion. The first ones that you can talk about are the Olmec civilizations. When it comes to the Olmecs, there is a lot of debate between the people who think that there were like big Olmec, one single Olmec civilization, and the people who believe that there were different sister civilizations that were happening at the same time in the region. I do think that nowadays research is leaning towards not a single Olmec civilization, but rather different Olmec city-states. As in the rest of the world, the first city-states are formed following the establishment of agricultural traditions, of agricultural practices that allow people to stay in one place. Like we all know this is a very basics, right? But it's no different in Mesoamerica. So once you have the agricultural societies, then you start slowly getting these groups, these more formed city states with controlled power. So one of the interesting things is that it talks about it from the perspective of when the societies stop being egalitarian and start being hierarchical. It's interesting to me in terms of Mesoamerica because I have never read the deep, complex political analysis of the evolution of power in the region in the different civilizations, right? I will talk more about that at the end of the video. So once you have that region that can be controlled by a centralized power, it's very interesting to read about how, as in the rest of the world, the power was justified through religion, through the origin myths, through the creation myths. So, the rulers were descendants of the gods, and that is how they justify their power. You can talk about a hierarchical society because of the different characteristics that come from the archaeology, including heavy mobilizations from different geographical regions to get prime source materials for construction, that type of thing. You have thrones, you have burials, you have all the characteristics of a ruler that ruled over a hierarchical centralized society. So those are the first types of civilizations that are born with the Olmecs, that then expand and move and give birth to different civilizations in different regions of Mesoamerica. So that is kind of like the brand that you can talk about with the Olmecs in the pre-classical. Now, there is also Teotihuacan. I'm not going to super focus on Teotihuacan in this video because Teotihuacan is major in Mesoamerican lore and it's very specific in the type of government that some archaeologists believe that was in place. There are a lot of mysteries in Teotihuacan, but it's very foundational for the future lore, let's say, of this city where kings were made, where the gods were born. That originates a myth of the ideal city that very much follows the following civilizations. So I'm not going to focus on Teotihuacan in this video. I will most likely talk about it in a future video when I talk about the Toltecs, when I talk about the King Arthur figure that I want to talk about because it's fascinating. So that is the pre-classical, and then you move to the classical period. And in the classical period, the big culture that you can talk about is, yes, Teotihuacan and also the Maya. So Teotihuacan would cover from the pre-classical to the classical, and the rise of the Maya classical kingdoms is during the classical period. That was super fascinating to read because I didn't know virtually anything about the Maya. I feel like every country is very prone to idolizing its central state or its central cities. So, like DC in the US or like Mexico City in Mexico. So the capital cities, the central cities, and then the periphery always gets overlooked. or the peripheries of the big regions, that is no different here. And so there is a focus on learning in school, learning about the Aztecs, learning about the central cultures in Mesoamerica, mostly about the Aztecs, because the Aztecs had the coincidence of existing when the Spanish came. And so when the project of Mexico as independent country started in the 19th century, the Aztecs were very much taken as like the brand of nationalism, and that has been adopted by governments ever since, where the discourse is very much like the Aztec nation, when in reality the Aztecs, weren't even like the most splendorous culture or the one that lasted the longest, which would be an interesting topic of discussion for another video. My point being that in school you don't learn a lot about the Mayans other than the fun facts that everyone likes to talk about, like the invention of the number 0, or like the astronomical discoveries, or outside of academia, all the conspiracy theories about the Mayans. I feel like in Mexico, the Aztecs are the country, the civilization that is most talked about, whereas internationally, I do feel like the Mayans are the ones that are most talked about because of the whole conspiracy theories about the end of the world and 2012 and all those types of things that the internet loves. So in my case, because I'm from Mexico, because I have lived in Mexico my whole life, and I have been going to school, or I went to school in Mexico my whole life, I learned mostly about the Aztecs and some fun facts about the Mayans. It is a commentary on how history is taught. And you can think about it in terms of your own country, how history is taught, the cultures that are left out of the official historical education, that people that are not going to be interested in reading history books are not going to learn about, which is mind-blowing to think about. And that was my case until I started reading history. So in a classical period, you have mostly the Mayan kingdoms. I talk about kingdoms because the power system was hereditary. I was very surprised because I'm used to reading about the post-classical civilizations, namely the Aztecs, which had a different type of power system that wasn't, father to son. It wasn't linear necessarily, whereas the Mayan kingdoms of the classic period were. So while reading about the Mayan kingdoms of the classical period, it did make me think about a lot about how the kingdoms worked in like the Middle Ages, where you would have a king that would be very much worshipped, whether religious or not. The king was always worshipped, but then you have like the son of the king, that there's like a big pomp and fanfare when the son of the king is born, and you announce the son of the king, and you make publicity all over town so people know the name of their prince, and they can start to worship him as well, so that when he rises to power, he is already revered, because ever since he was a baby, he was announced with the greatest fanfare, and there are parties thrown, that type of a thing. That is what happened with the Mayan kingdoms in the classical period. And another fascinating fact for me about the Mayans is how much information survives that is written by them. And there is a very famous numbering system called the long count, which was used during the classical period to keep count of the history of the kingdoms, the history of the lineages of the houses in power. So these were the classical kingdoms, the classical civilizations, the Maya. The Maya have interesting relations with Teotihuacan, and there are other interesting stuff that I'm not going to dive into. Moving on to end with the post-classical period. There is a period when the classical kingdoms start to decline. And that was very interesting to me, that time of transition. What happens is that you, in the time of splendor, you do have the figure of the king. I'm calling it a king. I'm making that parallel. I know it's not accurate, but that's what I'm doing. You do have that figure that is very much worshipped, very much revered. You have the sculptures, you have the throne, you have, as Enrique Florescano calls it, you have the whole theater, the theatrics of power in place. And people buy those theatrics, right? And you have the hereditary system, and you have the princess, and you have the art that is part of the theatrics. And suddenly you have this noble class that are starting to emulate things that were particular to the king. So they start dressing with fashions that maybe resemble certain garments that kings wear. As the economy starts to grow, these big noble families start to grow as well, and their power starts to grow, and they start to have more place in the palace, in the court, in the political arena. And because of that, they start also adopting these things. They want to emulate the theatrics of power. I forgot to mention, and I think it goes without saying, that there was also a rise of the merchant class and the growth of the trade routes, which also influenced that situation. And so there is a period of transition when these big classical kingdoms start to decline. So, as I said, you do see the decline of Teotihuacan in the classical period. You see the decline of the classical Maya kingdoms. You see the decline of these types of cultures. There's, of course, also, overpopulation, natural disasters, all those things that you can see in every single part of the world that leads to diasporas, that leads to the reformation, reorganization, and it eventually leads to the formation of the post-classical civilizations that are very much militaristic. So one of the characteristics of the post-classical civilizations is that they are founded by big warriors, military leaders that end up being worshipped as the kings were, but they are more like the big military warrior type. So that type of figure, So you have Topiltzin Quetzalcoatl in Tula, you have Kukulkan in Chichen Itza, big warriors that found big civilizations that end up being very much based on military, on war, on human sacrifice. So like the post-classical period is the rise of the more bellicose cultures in Mesoamerica. That is the idea, I feel like, that people have of the Mesoamerican cultures. So if you think of the big classic Mayan kingdoms, I feel like most people would confuse them with the idea that they have of the Mayans during the time of the conquest. Like the Mayans that the Spanish met are not the same Mayans of the classical period. And that is what I wanted to talk about today. Basically, all this evolution, all this change, there is a big complex evolution of the evolution of power, the evolution of civilizations, the evolution of the organization of power that goes on here. But the way that history is written presents certain highlights, certain aspects, rebrands, to put it into contemporary terms, rebrands cultures into their particular marketing schemes. So you do take the post-classical civilizations and you brand Mesoamerica with them, and that is the idea that remains. What I'm trying to talk about here is that it was is the level of complexity, political complexity, that happened in Mesoamerica that is not talked about, to the point where I, as a Mexican person who grew up in Mexico, who went to school in Mexico, had never heard or read about this complexity. And that's the word I want to use, complex. They were complex political societies. And here's the thing, right? Because the way that the region has been portrayed in media, Mel Gibson, I'm looking at you, paints a certain picture that permeates not only internationally but also within the same country. And that is the depressing aspect of colonialism, where you as a country, you have a certain discourse in mind, and even the discourse that tries to revindicate the indigenous cultures is very much limited, is very much condescending, is very much also following the branding that was done in a certain time period, and doesn't acknowledge the diversity and the complexity of the cultures. And that is something that I have been thinking about while reading this book. I was watching a live show from a Mexican archaeologist I follow, and they were saying that we would need like a Game of Thrones type of show to portray the different scheming that went on. And that's the funny thing. It's, yes, like if you think about Mesoamerica, and I'm going to use pop culture references, and speaking about, I feel like, international audiences, they would not picture Game of Thrones, they would picture Mel Gibson's movie, right? Like that is the difference in terms of like media. That's something that Matthew Rethel talks about in his book, the When Moctezuma Met Cortez. It's very focused on like the historiography and the way how art has written the narrative of the conquest and of the people of Mesoamerica. So that's what I wanted to talk about today. I hope it was interesting. I'm going to try to be making these videos of the history stuff I've learned, but also the stuff that I've thought about the stuff that I've learned. That's like my idea with these Friday Reads history specific videos. So that is from The Origins of Power in Mesoamerica. I'm going to write down below the title that I gave you of the other Florescano book that is translated that you can look up. And as I said, I am preparing a video with recommendations for books in English. So that would be it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I will see you with another bookish video. And I would love to hear you in the comments, thoughts, etc. And in the meantime, I wish you happy reading.